You guys can hear me fine without a microphone, right? I don't want to feel that we wasted that. My mom says no things carries anyway. And so I'm really excited to be here. And actually, the reason that I'm here speaks to, as we start talking about human rights tonight, it speaks to how quickly our world is changing. Because about 3.5 weeks ago, I was at a lodge, and I had a group of folks who were going to go gorilla trekking in northwestern Rwanda. And I had never met Maya and her family my entire life, and they were having breakfast, and we ended up having a conversation. And 3.5 weeks later, we're no longer in Rwanda, but we're in Toledo. And so I have never been to Toledo. I've been to 90 countries, and I've not been to Toledo, Ohio, so I can add that to the list. I talked to the governor this morning. He's like, "What are you doing in Toledo?" I said, "You wouldn't understand." It's a very long story. And so I thought tonight, I want to talk to you about human rights, and I want to talk to you a little bit about, especially the students. I had an awesome dinner this evening with a very impressive group of students who will all probably be my boss someday. And I want to talk to you a little bit about kind of how I ended up doing human rights, or I'm not sure if you do them, but how I got involved with human rights issues, both on the domestic side and on the international side. So I'll walk through both. In the second part, we'll kind of get into the PowerPoint that I have. And then I'm going to open it up for questions so that we hopefully at least answer as many of your questions as possible. During the dinner, I understand that you've had very good speakers, so the expectations are high, so I hope I don't disappoint. The story of kind of how I got to where I'm at, my Aunt Sue is actually in the back. She lives in Lansing, Michigan. And my mom and dad were both educators. So when I grew up, my mom was a first grade teacher for 30 years, and my dad was a social worker, and I swore that I would not do anything that they did. I decided at a very young age that actually this is very important to tell the story in Toledo. I didn't need sleep at night. I only needed about 3 hours of sleep, and so my parents said I couldn't run around the house and I couldn't go outside, but I could watch TV. So I watched for 10 years. My favorite TV show was MASH. And that's how I know about Toledo, Ohio. And so I decided I didn't want to do what my parents said. I wanted to be fabulously wealthy, and I wanted to be a surgeon. And so that's all I did. I read every book that Donald Trump wrote. I went to Creighton University to do my undergraduate. During my time at Creighton, I did everything I needed to do to be a surgeon. And then at the 11th hour, I wasn't quite sure that I wanted to be a surgeon. And when I look at my two primary goals, to be fabulously wealthy and be a surgeon, I failed at both of those by my senior year of college. And I tell people that by not becoming a surgeon, I'm relatively certain that I saved lives. And so I decided, I went from Creighton, I went down to, I had a great mentor. His name was Dr. Monif, and he told me at the 11th hour, so my parents said, "You guys, just go down to Tulane, do your master's in international public health. You love international issues. And go figure it out." So I went down to Tulane University, and I did my first master's degree in international public health, and I did my first trip to Africa. I went to Ghana when I was about 22 years old, and I worked on a malaria project there. I didn't care that much about malaria, except I didn't want to catch it. But I did want to learn about Africa. It was my first experience internationally with human rights, and really understanding and seeing abject poverty in a way that I'd never seen poverty before. I came back, and I worked with an organization called Family Tree, working with foster care kids in Colorado for about a year. I went back and I did my second master's at Tulane. And that's where I really started to cut my teeth in terms of working with the poor. And that's where I probably made the decision in my life that that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. I went down and I was working on my master's in sociology, and I started working with inner city heroin addicts. And you started to see abject poverty not in Africa. You started to see human rights issues and abject poverty in your own communities. And I saw the poorest of the poor in New Orleans, Louisiana. I remember sitting across the table from a kid. People always say, "Well, how did you get into doing what you're doing with homelessness in Africa?" And there was one moment that I paid attention to. And I'm going to talk a lot about paying attention, but there was one moment I paid attention to. I remember sitting across the kid. We were doing interviews and studies for the Centers for Disease Control on HIV and hepatitis C. I remember sitting across the table from this kid. I was asking all these questions, and he was 22 years old, and he was shooting about $300 worth of dope a day. And so he had to figure out how to prostitute himself, how to get his hit every day. And I looked at this kid. He was really charismatic, really smart. And I thought to myself, wow, if that kid had been born into my family, and I'd been born into his family, I would probably be shooting about $300 worth of dope a day. And he would probably be trying to figure out what he's going to do with his friends after he finishes this interview today. And so it was that whole thing of situational and equity that became very, very aware of. When we talk about human rights issues, and wherever you do your human rights work, if it's in the United States or in other countries, it's an equity issue. That there's nobody in the world that I've met yet who said, oh my gosh, I hope that I grow up to be poor. And so I started thinking about that, and that's really started to define my work. I went back to Colorado, and I went to finish my PhD at the University of Colorado, and I started working with the poor back in Colorado, and I decided that that's what I was probably going to spend the rest of my life doing, was really serving the poor in some capacity. And so I started working at a homeless and runaway youth organization called Urban Peak, and there were about 6 of us when we started. There was about an $80,000 or $250,000 budget. We learned how to build housing for young people, and we learned how to get heroin addicts and street kids off the streets and into housing and surrounding services. And then, as I was wrapping up my PhD, a man came by the name of John Hickenlooper came along, and he's got a weird name. And he was a brewmeister and a geologist. He was an unemployed geologist who ended up owning a brewery, and then ended up doing what any unemployed geologist would do. He ran for mayor. And he won. And he did something really interesting. When John Hickenlooper ran for mayor, he's a businessman. He's self-made. He made a lot of money. And when he ran for mayor, he was talking about how he was going to restore downtown Denver, bring restaurants to downtown and arts and culture back to downtown. And he had one tiny problem. When he was running for mayor, a gentleman ran against him that was a homeless guy named Dwight. So every debate that they'd go to and every conversation that they'd have when they talked to the candidates, John Hickenlooper would talk about how he's going to restore the downtown, and Dwight would say, well, what are we going to do about homeless people? And John Hickenlooper started to understand what the homeless issues were in our community. And so when John became elected mayor, he said that one of his priorities would be to figure out what it would take to end homelessness in our own community. And so about a year and a half into his administration, I left my work with Urban Peak because I actually really believed that this was a man who was very, very committed to not just talking the talk, but walking the walk. And so I went to work with John Hickenlooper for he and I have worked together about 10 years now, so we're growing old together. But we started by working on his homeless initiative. And we started by really understanding what the human rights are of the people in our own community. We learned what it took to build housing and services. And so over the course of about 5 years when the governor was mayor, we built about 3,000 units of housing, we raised about $50 million, and we figured out how to decrease chronic homelessness. So the poorest of the poor, we figured out how to move them into housing and off the streets by about 65%. And then John Hickenlooper went on to run for governor, and I was his policy director. And then for the last 4 years, I worked as his deputy chief of staff and a senior advisor. All the roles around advocating for human rights, around health and wellness, around homelessness, around education. And so that was my public service life, and we'll talk more about that as we weave it in. But now I'm going to shift gears a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit about how that ties into the work that I've been doing in Africa and why I met Maya and her family. And so as I was finishing up my work at Urban Peak and I was finishing up my PhD, I decided that I wanted to really understand not just human rights and homelessness and poverty in our own country, but I wanted to go and look at what that looked like outside of our own country. And I'd done it a little bit when I'd gone to Ghana, but I didn't have a really good sense of what that meant and how you fix things, or is it even possible? And so I got a fellowship through, it was called the Livingston Fellowship. It was through a local foundation. And it's interesting. The fellowship was driven by a man who was very successful as a CEO. He was the CEO of a Fortune 500 company called Honeywell. And he believed that if you're going to, he said, we put millions and millions of dollars into nonprofits and charities around our community, but we don't really invest in leadership. We don't invest in folks like you who are emerging leaders and say, what is it going to take for you to be good nonprofit leaders? And so I was one of 5 people who received one of the first years of this fellowship, and it was called the Livingston Fellowship. It was designed to invest in emerging leaders who wanted to work on community issues. And one of the things I said I wanted to do with that was really to understand international human rights and international poverty better. And so I did 2 trips, and the first trip I did became really really important because I met this man. So this is Henry, not the lizard, but the man behind me. And Henry, it's interesting, I joke about this. Henry will someday hunt me down and find me because I talk about him, but I don't talk about him very nicely. He was really an awful creature. I met him on a safari in South Africa as part of my fellowship. And he was very arrogant, and he was very chauvinistic, and he was very misogynistic. And I looked at him as you're not a very pleasant person. But I just spent 2 days with this man, listening to him talk. And so my advice to us is always find the gems in whatever you're doing. And so he finally told me something that became very important to the point where the last 10 years I talked about Henry. So he'd be mortified that I'm telling the story. He's driving around, he talked about life in the bush in South Africa. What is the most dangerous, what do more people get killed by in South Africa than any other animal in the bush? Well, the mosquito thing, the smart people always bring that up and it totally ruins the thing. But like big animals, like what's the most dangerous animal? Yes, mosquitoes, but what's the biggest animal? Huh? Elephant. More people get killed by elephants because they don't pay attention and they'll trample you. And Henry was talking about how when he was 16, he was walking through the bush and he wasn't paying attention. He was probably thinking about himself. And all of a sudden, there were 6 elephants standing around him and he was about to be trampled. And he had to leave and get out of it. And obviously the elephants didn't trample him because I have a picture of him and he became a safari guide. And he said, there's this South African saying of let po. And he said it means to pay attention. And it was this great thing because when he told me the story, I was like, well, that's interesting. I didn't realize how important that story would become over time. Let po, pay attention. We don't always pay attention to the really big things around. So it's a little cliche, and especially because there were 6 elephants, we don't pay attention to the elephant in the room. That wasn't the reason that I told that story. But the let po piece is we don't pay attention. And that if we do our human rights work, and if we start working in our communities, what happens sometimes is we don't necessarily always pay attention to the most important things around us. And so the purpose of Henry was to get me to think about that. We didn't pay a whole lot of attention to our homeless, actually, in Denver when we were dealing with the human rights issues. We didn't really understand who our homeless were, or even what that looked like. And so when you think of a homeless guy in Denver, what do you think of? Or in Toledo, what's the first thing that comes to mind? What does a homeless person look like? What's the first image that comes to mind? What do they look like? Worn clothing. Yes, they have worn clothing. What else do they look like? What's the image you got of a homeless person? Old or young? They tend to be old, right? And what do they do? When they're sitting there, what do they do? What is the visual that you have in your head? What do they have?
Hold up the sign.
Huh?
Hold up the sign.
They have a sign in one hand, and what do they have in the other hand? A cup or a bottle, right? And what do they push? A shopping cart. Like our image of the homeless person is the crazy dude pushing the shopping cart, sitting on the side of the street and holding a sign and begging for money. And when we started to pay attention to that, we started to learn some things that were really interesting. When you start to pay attention to human rights, that homeless guy is lazy, and he's a bum, and he's mentally ill, and he's crazy. But when we dig deeper and we start looking at the human rights around it, that homeless guy, about 30% of them are homeless veterans. Like people who fought in foreign wars who came back and didn't have access to services. And when we started digging a little bit deeper, we found out that those guys weren't like lazy, but they were mentally ill and they had substance abuse issues and they didn't have access to resources. That if you actually went to them and you said, we can get you some treatment, some services, most of those people actually wanted some help. And when we started looking at the homeless guy, another really interesting thing happened. Malcolm Gladwell taught us, because he started writing about this stuff, he was really interesting and we wanted to pay attention to things that we weren't paying attention to. We started to find out that guy's really expensive. That homeless guy costs about $40,000 to keep him outside. It costs us $40,000 across the country. Right? Because that homeless guy, when he gets sick, where does he go?
Emergency room.
The most expensive unit of care in the entire country, and that's where we encourage them to go. They go to the emergency room. That when they drink too much, where do they go? Well, they go to the emergency room, and then where do they go? Jail or detox. Some of the most expensive services. Our homeless use the most expensive services in the country. We found out our most famous, most fancy hotel in Denver is a place called the Brown Palace. It would be cheaper to keep most of our homeless people there each night than it would be for the services that they use each day. And so we started to think differently about it. I said we need to start thinking differently about our social issues. And so I started going over, at the tail end of my fellowship, I ended up going over to Uganda and Rwanda. I finished my PhD, and I heard this piece on NPR, and they were talking about how they are rehabilitating the child soldiers in northern Uganda. How many of you guys have heard about Kony 2012 and the child soldiers and invisible children? I was really curious, how do you do that? Like, I looked at complex social issues and human rights in our own community. It's really hard to get a homeless person into housing, but it's doable. But how do you take a kid who's been kidnapped from their house, they're a victim, and then taught to go and kill all their family members and all their community members, so then they became a perpetrator? How do you bring them back home? What does that look like? And so I wanted to go figure that out. And so I ended up going to Uganda and Rwanda. My mother is always mortified about the places that I decide I'm just going to go to. And so I went there, and I spent a little bit of time in Kampala. And I met a woman by the name of Shane Gilbert, and she ran a grassroots organization working with women and children in the slums. Was a great human rights advocate and really tried to figure out what it took to connect with those folks. And so I spent a little bit of time in the slums of Kampala, and then I went up to the north. And I went up to see the rehabilitation center where the child soldiers were. And then I met this fabulous woman by the name of Sister Jovita, larger than life. She's a very large sister. She's one of those people where you're in the presence of her, she's amazing. Like, she makes you want to cry. She's awesome. She's serving this long line of women with most of the women who were alive with their babies had HIV, malaria, so just really, really hard, complex social issues that she's dealing with. And Sister was a strong, very impressive woman. And I went into her, she showed me where her medical clinic was, and I looked at the shelves, and there wasn't very much of anything in her medical clinic. I was like, oh my God, how do you do this? And I was like, I've got to help. I need to help this woman. I was a 26-year-old PhD. I should be able to solve the problems of the world. And so I made my first promise in Africa. I looked at her, and I was like, I'm going to be bold. I'm going to make my first big promise. I looked at her, and I said, Sister Jovita, I promise you that when I leave today, I'm going to come back, and I'm going to fill your medical shelves with supplies. And she looked at me, and she's so sweet, and she said, that would be awesome if you did that. But she said, you know, if you don't, we'll be all right. And it was so interesting. It was that whole message for that Africa is trying to teach us about human rights, that Sister Jovita, when I left that day, was not going to sit on the side of the street and wait for 2 weeks for some gangly white dude to show back up with some medical supplies. She's like, I got a lot of work to do. She said, if you come back, that's great. I'd love to work with you more, but if you don't, we'll be all right. And it's that message that as we're working with our board, we're working in our communities, that we've got to change that dialogue a little bit between need versus want. So I left, and we'll talk a little bit more about that, but I went down to the south of Uganda, and I fell madly in love with this rural, hilly region of Uganda and Rwanda, and Maya's been there, and it's absolutely stunning. And there's a lake there called Lake Binyoni, and I'm very, very interested and really enjoyed that region. You'll see a little bit more of it as we talk tonight. And then I went down into Rwanda, and I saw where the mountain gorillas and conservation are intersecting to create jobs and address poverty in a really unexpected way. And then I ended up in Kigali, where you see what happens when the aftermath of what happens when a country genocides a third of its population. 20 years ago, 1 in 3 people were killed in Rwanda during genocide. So I was fascinated. I had this unbelievably amazing trip, and I was fortified. I met Sister Jovita, and I'd been in the slums, and I was a servant of the poor, and I wanted to do something international. I wanted to do something more than just travel around and take pictures of poor people. And so I went back to Shane, and I said, Shane, I think I'm going to come back here and help you. I would like to do something. And she looked at me, and she said, please don't do anything. She said, Africa, it's filled with NGOs and organizations that are flocking over and building things and creating things and doing things, and they're not doing any listening or thinking as they do it, they act. And she said there's so much going on over here, but very few people are spending the time to really understand what's happening in the community. Very few people are trying to let go and pay attention to what the issues are before we just go and fix things. And so it's very interesting. She said, if you really want to help, she's like, actually, bring students and community leaders and have them come over and have conversations and connect with folks before they actually go and do something. And I talked to the leaders who hosted me for dinner tonight, and I likened it to what would happen in Toledo if and went over to one of your poorest communities and started building a school. You would look at them and say, what are you doing? Please don't build another thing before you understand what the issues are, because the issues are more complicated in Toledo than just going and building another school. Well, they're more complicated in Uganda and Rwanda, and they're more complicated across the world as we address our human rights. And so what I learned from that trip was to let go, and what it turned into was the birth of what is now the Global Livingston Institute. And the Global Livingston Institute is complicated in some ways because we don't build anything. I don't have pictures of schools that we've built or medical clinics that we've created. I have pictures of about 400 students and community leaders that have come over with me over the last 4 years to really learn about what's happening in Uganda and Rwanda. To have conversations with folks like Sister Jovita and the women in the slums and the child soldiers to figure out, after those conversations, then what is it that you want to do? Right? How do you listen and think before you act? And so that's become the mission of our organization, and the GLI is really dedicated to improving communities globally. I love my board because you cannot possibly get more broad than that vision statement. And so you can pretty much do whatever you want when it comes to human rights. And so I'll talk to you a little bit about what we do. And so, so the awareness that we're creating has happened in two ways. One, we've really created a space for education. That we've created a space for students to come and learn about what is happening with international development. We teach 2 courses over there through the University of Colorado, Denver. We're developing curriculum with 2 other universities, with Creighton University and with Cornell University. There's some people here who are going to Cornell in the fall. And so, so we're looking at the research to really understand those issues better before we actually go do things. We do a women's leadership summit every year. And we learn from the 10 women. We bring about 10 women CEOs and philanthropists over from the United States. And they spend 3 days with 10 women from Uganda and Rwanda who never have a seat at the table. And they have really interesting conversations. I think about how often we take for granted how many places we get invited and how many seats at the table that we all have. When we were just getting ready to do our first Women's Leadership Summit about 2 years ago, I had gone to an event for the governor. I was sitting at the head table and I was late, and I show up and I sat down and there's a little name tag there for me that was handwritten. And it took time to do that, and I had a seat at that table. And I was annoyed because I was like, I gotta hurry, I gotta go. I started thinking about these women that we're inviting to the Women's Leadership Summit, the 10 Ugandan women who never get invited to anything. Think about your last week, how many things have you been invited to. Think about how many things you've been invited to where you don't even go because you've got too many other things that you've been invited to. And there's 10 women that we invite to the Women's Leadership Summit that never get invited to anything. And we started to create a seat at the table, and we started to learn from those women as we've developed the Global Livingston Institute. About 3 years ago, we did what any rational folks would do, is we started to have more and more students coming, and we started to do more around education, and we started to do more around job creation. We did the logical thing. We went and we bought a peninsula. We actually leased the peninsula. We have a 99-year lease on a peninsula in southern Uganda, this lake, that I'll talk to you about. And it's really shaped and defined those conversations. So anyway, this is where we're at. That's Colorado to Uganda. The last year, as we've been doing our education piece, what's the biggest challenge around Africa? What is everybody talking about? If you say Africa, what do people say? In the last year, there's one word associated with Africa. What is it? Ebola. Ebola. Every one of the students, everybody who's going, everybody who has a conversation, if you say Africa, it's interesting because we really don't understand, we don't pay attention to the issues that are around us. Ebola is up in the western part of Africa, right at the tip. Ebola, actually, when people would say you're going to Uganda, are you worried about getting Ebola? I'd say, well, it's actually closer to Rio de Janeiro than it is to Uganda because we don't pay attention and we don't always understand what those issues are. I had a very humbling thing happen. We had a music fest, and I'll talk about the music fest. I was going over there in October. It was the height of the Ebola. Even my mom was a little bit worried that I might come home with Ebola. I was like, Mom, there's no Ebola in Uganda or Rwanda. In 2012, outbreak of Ebola. And they wanted to understand human rights. They wanted to understand how to they said, we want to be the best in the world in terms of how to contain Ebola. Some of the best containment units for Ebola are in Uganda and Rwanda. The CDC came in and they actually know how to contain disease there better than any other countries in Africa. I showed up in October and everybody was worried. It was the week that you guys remember when the doctor got diagnosed with Ebola in Dallas? And everybody started talking about Ebola. And so I fly to Rwanda, and they have really amazing doctors. Rwanda, Maya can tell you, has an unbelievable healthcare system and a really great infrastructure. So you show up at the airport, they have a little temperature thing to make sure that they don't have a temperature. And you have to fill out this paperwork. And so I'm filling out the paper, and they said, do you have any of these symptoms? And I don't have any of these symptoms. And have you been to any of these three countries? Have you been to Liberia, Sierra Leone, or the United States in the last 2 years? I was like, oh my God, Rwanda is afraid that the United States is going to bring Ebola here. How awesome is that? That our perceptions, and we don't pay attention. And it's so interesting, our world is changing, and when you want to talk about human rights, Rwanda wanted to know if I was in Dallas because they don't want it in their country any more than we want it in ours. That how do you start changing that dialogue? It's fascinating. Uganda and Rwanda, I would be shocked if they end up having Ebola moving to and they're doing a great job of containing it. And so there's another example as you start traveling and you start your own professional careers, how you pay attention to things that we don't necessarily always pay attention to in the work that we do. And so in 2009, we listened. And there's some links here to some of the trips that we can email this out to you all. I'm not going to show all the videos right now. You guys can still, if we have time, we're going to watch them. But we did our first trip in 2009. I took 18 students from the University of Denver, and we listened. We spent time in Kampala. We went to the slums. We hung out with Sister Javita. We went to the child soldiers. We went down to the south in Lake Binyoni. We went gorilla trekking, and then we went to Kigali. And we started listening. We started having really, really interesting conversations with the community. And then in 2000, from 2009 to 2012, we thought. We had about 300 students and community leaders who helped us think about these issues, to help us understand the importance of creating jobs as opposed to building a medical. The importance of engaging and treating people reciprocally as opposed to treating them as a charity case. And we tend to go to Uganda and Rwanda and Africa and other parts of the world and say to people, oh my God, how can we help you? We're here, you poor thing. Nobody wants to be treated like that. And so how do you start changing that dialogue and start changing that conversation? The Ugandans and the Rwandans are as excited about being part of conversations and fixing things as we are. And so what does that look like? And so from 2009 to 2012, we thought, the man who's sitting next to me, this ended up being a very, very important picture because it was right before we decided to get a peninsula. And this is Peter Mowbray. Peter Mowbray is a Canadian, and he's a curmudgeon. He was the CEO up until about a year ago of one of the largest construction companies west of the Mississippi. So really, really fascinating man. He's always grumpy. And he came to dinner when I met him at dinner with he's got a lovely, charming wife named Joanne, and we're sitting at dinner. And Joanne's like, oh my God, tell me all about Africa, I want to hear about it. And as we have dinner and we're having a nice meal, Joanne's like, oh my God, Peter, we've got to go to Africa. And he's like, we're definitely not going to Africa. We're sure as hell not going with Jamie. Well, he ended up going to Africa with me because Joanne said he had to. And so we go. And we had this fabulous trip. And Peter listened to me thought, because he was a master of the universe. He was a CEO. He knew everything and he had lots and lots and lots of money. And so, and he listened to me thought, and this is our last night in Rwanda. We're having this really, really nice dinner. And he looks at me and I was like, okay, we survived this trip. We're going home. This was a big successful trip. Maybe you'll write me a check. That'd be great. And he looks at me and he said, Jamie, he said, this has been an unexpectedly good trip. He's like, what do you want? And when the CEO of a massive construction company asks any of you all, what do you want? Have a good answer. I didn't have a good answer at the time. And we thought through it and we figured it out. And over the course of the last 3 years, Peter helped me along with a bunch of other friends build what's now Anticity. So we ended up creating a space for these conversations and these dialogues to happen. So, and that's the Global Living Institute. I'll show you some of it, but I want to kind of walk you through kind of the places where we did our listening and our thinking. This is Kampala. This is the slums that we work in these are run-of-the-mill slums in a place called Katanga. And this is the thread of life. Come Let's Dance works with these women and actually hires them, and they have crafts. They make purses, they make shoes, they make beads, and it's a way for them to actually educate and put their kids to school. And so we started to learn through the thread of life the importance of actually creating jobs. This is our campus in Kampala that we've actually just recently developed. And then this is Leeuwen. This is where all of the Invisible Children and the child and soldier stories are about. If you've watched Invisible Children, if you've seen the stories of the child soldiers, I'd encourage you to watch something else about the child soldiers, because I don't know that the Invisible Children folks did a lot of listening and thinking as much as they did acting and telling a story. That they told a very interesting story. I don't know that they told a very accurate story. But Leeuwen is a very sad, very intense part of the world. It's also absolutely stunning. It's about 250 kilometers south of Sudan. And then this is Sister Jovita, and this is the clinic that I was telling you about that they run. And this is the rehabilitation center. And then this is the lake. This is where we built it to see. And so we have a little peninsula that's around, it's about 10 minutes on a boat ride from the main dock, and it's where we have our conversations. And some really interesting things happen when we built it to see. I want to see if we have, I want to see that link really quick. I'm going to show you how we built it to see really quick. This is connected to internet, so you guys have gotten so modern, tech savvy. Never really able to do that. It takes a lot of buffer building. There's more to it than just this. So, I'm going to talk if this goes on. So this is the light. And when we started building, we said, oh, let's create I wanted to create a space like the Aspen Institute, or the Bellagio Center that's in Italy, where they created a space for the CEOs and the foundation leaders and the thought leaders to all come together and solve complex social issues. And that's awesome. I think that's great that there's a place for Tony Blair and Hillary Clinton and CEO giants to all come together now. What would happen if you created that same kind of a space in a really beautiful, awesome place, but you actually created it for students and community leaders and teachers and the Sister Jovitas and the women who are working in the slums? And so that's what we created. And so we said, let's create this space. And so about 2 years ago, he said, well, what are you doing? I said, well, we're doing education. We're going to create a place for these conversations to happen. But something very unintended happened along the way. Thomas Merton talks about the fact that you should not to trust the work, not to trust in the results, trust in the work. And then along the way, the unintended consequences are what changes everything. And so the unintended consequences of this is we created a center, but when we built it, what do we need to do to build it? Like, how do you build a center in Southern Uganda? What do you need? You need material. So where do we get the material? From the local community, right? And then once you got that material, then what do you need? You have to build it, right? And who do you need to build it? You need workers. So we ended up employing 150 people to help us build this center. And that's where we started to see the unintended consequences. Because like, wow, it wasn't about it was about creating the space, but it was about creating those jobs. And so all of a sudden the community was actually part of something. That we were doing something that was very, very different than what they'd been involved in before. It wasn't about us coming and saying, we're going to build a school for you. We said, we're going to have you help us put this together. So this is everything that we did on this peninsula had to be done by hand. There's no machines. So we had to bring everything over by boat. That's our engineer. His name was James. James hated it when I came onto the site. I made him nervous, and he didn't want anything. He didn't want me to touch anything or do anything. He knew I screwed up. So he was always happy when I left. And so this is, it took us about 7 months to build it. The gentleman there is a guy by the name of Matthew Ronald. He graduated from the Leeuwen. He said, I want to go, I want to think differently. the same OSHA regulations and hazard policies and everything. The fact that nobody fell off on the ladder, the only person who was injured actually in the building that was 150 employees, about 38, we created 38 beds and about 12 buildings. The only person was we hired all local. You guys, our manager, I think the week before we opened, a hammer fell off and hit him in the head. He's fine. That's the only injury we have reported. After we finished building the center, we had to have people who ran. And so then what happens when you have to get people running? You create more jobs. So we ended up hiring 20 people that you'll see them at the end. And what I learned as we were listening and we were thinking and we were starting to act is what happens when you hire 20 local Ugandans who've never had a full-time job in their entire lives. And some really cool things start to happen. As a matter of fact, my favorite story, so over the course of the last 2 years, we've paid them every month, we pay them on time. We pay them a competitive wage. We take care of their families and we help them with their health care. It's been the most humbling piece because it wasn't what we started out to do. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when Peter said, what do you want? I didn't say I want to create 20 first-time jobs for Ugandans and see what happens to their lives. I didn't say I wanted to go and employ a community of 150 folks to help us build a center. But those unintended consequences, and when you let go, some of the outcomes change a little bit for you. And they're still changing. I just got back about 2 weeks ago. That's the trip that I was on when I met Maya. And we were walking back from Bright's village. Bright is one of our employees, and he lives about 20 minutes away by boat. We spend a lot of time in his village because it's absolutely spectacular, it's beautiful. Two, I'm not really sure that they really need anything from us. They're very, very awesome, they're very, very cool, and it's a very fun place to visit. And we were walking back and we had 6 couples, or 3 couples, they're all philanthropists, they're all very well resourced, and they've traveled all around the world walking around. And Bright's so proud, and we look over it, and by his house there's a pile of bricks there. And Bright's actually been able to save up enough money right now that he's able to actually pay for his kid to go to school in the local community, and he's building an extension to his house. He's not building an extension to his house through a microloan for me. He's not building an extension to his house because I gave him bricks. He's building an extension to his house because he has a full-time job, and he saved enough money that he and his family decided that they need more space in their house. And that was the unintended consequence of what happens when you listen, you think, as you're acting, and what does that look like? And so anyway, I'm not exactly sure. Oh, this is the second part of this. Sorry. I was like, what? I'm not sure what this is, but we're going to skip over this because it's not really part of your presentation. Let's see, and then I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint, which is right here. And so here's the center, and it just gives you a sense of what that looks like. And when we act, like I said, as of this year, we'll have actually about 400 students and communities that come over to Africa. I talked to you a little bit about the employment. I'll tell you one more story because it was a fun story. So we've really tried to create a space, and as you all are doing your human rights work and you're doing your community development work, there's that piece of making sure you go into it with a plan, but also keeping the door open and making sure you open up opportunities that you don't expect. And so again, as we were listening and thinking, we had a student come over about 2 years ago. He's a musician, he's an artist, he's a very cool kid, a little bit high-strung. And he went around and kind of hung out, and he fell in love with the music in southern Uganda. And he came and he's like, we should do a music festival here in Kabale. I don't need to do a music festival in Kabale. He said, well, I would like to do it. I said, you should do a music festival. So he went back to Tulane, that was his alma mater. And about 2 weeks later, a guy calls me by the name of Andrew Ward. Andrew Ward is crazy as a loon. He's a nutcase. He goes to Tulane, or he went to Tulane. If you Google Andrew Ward, if Andrew Ward was sitting here, I would tell this exact same story. He wears a white suit and a banjo. He's on America's Got Talent. He's awful. He's crazy. He's a nutcase. And he's like, I will do your music festival. And I said, you should do that. And so Andrew Ward goes and he does our music festival. How many of you guys have heard of the Flowbots? Does anyone know the Flowbots? You have to have some Colorado connection. Flowbots are a Colorado band. They have one famous song, I Can Ride My those are the Flowbots. So he goes and he meets the Flowbots, and he said, the Flowbots. And they went down to New Orleans, and he got another musician, a gentleman who plays bass. Super cool, very big guy who plays bass. His name's Mark Allen. Tattooed all the way down both arms. And he also, in addition to playing bass, and in addition to having an awesome jazz radio station in New Orleans, he is the lead HIV prevention doc of New Orleans. And so I said, well, that's a good find. And then we found another guy in Nashville, another crazy musician. All these musicians all get together, fly over to Uganda, and for 3 days, they hang out in Ntisi. And they play on washboards, and they bang on drums in the morning, and they played Ugandan songs, and they had all the local musicians come together, and they recorded things in this crazy closet of a music studio. We brought 2 musicians down from Kampala who came, they're R&B artists, and do all kinds of stuff that I have no rhythm or soul for, and they did all of this, and for 3 days they did it. And on the 3rd day, we went to the main part of Kigali, and they have a soccer stadium there. We rented out the soccer stadium, and we hosted the largest free concert that's ever been done in Uganda. We had 5,000 people showed up who'd never been to a concert before in their entire lives. It was really interesting because, again, so it was a concert. So people were like, well, that's not really fixing Africa. But this is where it gets really interesting. The concert, the Ugandan government's done a miserable time getting young people to test for HIV and to learn about HIV and HIV services. The day of the concert, we had 5,000 people show up. We tested 850 kids for HIV that day. More than the State Department's ever been able to do in one sitting in a rural community in Uganda. It was really, really interesting. With my staff, I'm very cheap, and so I don't like spending money on anything that's unnecessary. You should probably spend all of your money on human rights. And so they said, well, we made tickets. I was like, why would you possibly spend money on tickets for a free concert? That seems so dumb. And Matthew said, no, take these tickets, go into town. And well, raise your hand if you remember your first concert. What was your first concert? Oh my God, that's so cool. that actually doesn't make me feel old, so thank you. I'm not going to ask you the rest of you guys went to. Mine was Billy Joel, and he was an artist. You probably never heard of it. When you got those tickets, was it exciting? Like, do you remember those tickets?
My dad made me go, so I don't
Okay. Thanks. Now you know. So, how many of you guys have a ticket for one of your concerts? So a ticket stub for one of your concerts. It's a big deal. I went into town and I started handing out tickets. It was a big deal. Like, here's a guy who's never, a 35-year-old man's never been to a concert. There's going to be a concert tonight. He took his tickets and he put them in his pocket. It was a big deal. That these people were actually being invited to something. That they had a seat at the table. It was a really big deal. And so it's that thing as you're doing your work, whatever it is around human rights, what are those things you're going to learn that we didn't write into our plan for the music festival, that we're going to make 5,000 people feel like they have a seat at the table, that we're going to test 850 people for HIV. And so pay attention, let Poe. And so the music festival happened. We're gearing up for this year's music festival. We're actually bringing 2 of the Ugandan musicians to the United States. We're going to do a tour through Colorado and New Orleans and Nashville. I have no idea how to organize a music tour, so they're going to figure all that out. And then we're going to go back and we're going to have, what we'd like to do is we would like to grow it into the largest music festival in East Africa. And we're working with the government right now figuring out how do you do better HIV prevention? And how do you use something like this as a vehicle to change things? And so this is the Women's Association. The Women's Association has been awesome about teaching us what it means, not just to do education, but really helping us understand that other part of the GLI that we didn't know we were going to really focus on around job creation when we first started. And so they're going through their second iteration of the Candle Company because their first round wasn't great, and they're figuring it out as they go along. We've hosted TEDx talks. We learned that when you create a space for young people and internationally, there's an international dialogue. There's young people who are 16 and 17 years old who are as excited to be having these conversations, to be talking about human rights as you are. That they want to have those conversations. We got licensed to do TEDx at the Lake. And when we did it, I thought, oh, this will be cute. It was about social entrepreneurs. I was like, we're going to have a bunch of young Ugandans talking about how they're making beads and candles and all that kind of stuff. These guys came down to talk about how they want to build internet companies. They came down to talk about an app that they want to start. They came down to talk about how they can build resources and figure out how to raise funds so that they can actually invest in their companies. And so they're having the same conversations, and they want to have the same conversations that you all are having. And when you're talking about human rights, we kind of talk about human rights in a way where it's what can we do about human rights, but talking about human rights is not just about what we can do here, but what do we do together with the Ugandans and the Rwandans and the people that we work with around the world? And what does that look like, and how do we do that in partnership with one another? Let's see if I want to make sure I didn't miss anything here before. And so I'm going to wrap up. I'm going to open up for questions because I really appreciate your coming and having a conversation with me tonight. And a complicated word, I love this piece. This is the taxi park in Uganda. And so when you go to the taxi park for the first time, somebody will say, well, you say, well, I don't want to go to Leeuwen. They say, well, just go over by the taxis that are going to Leeuwen. And I have no idea what you're talking about. There does not seem to be any order there, but in that taxi park, there is a part of that taxi park that only goes to Leeuwen. And there is an enormous amount of order in that taxi park. And it's very easy to figure it out once you understand what's happening there. And once you take the time to listen and think and figure it out, you'll know that there's not just all kinds of different taxis, but those taxis go to different places. And so, as you all are having these conversations, I'm so impressed with the fact that you're talking about human rights, that you're talking about international development. I think the biggest challenge is I mentor young people, both in my work with the governor and my work internationally. Really nudging you all. I think that we've gotten to a place right now where we're not thinking differently and we're not thinking big. We tend to kind of take the same approach to a lot of more complex social issues. I think there's a generation, and I think the reason the GLI exists isn't because I said, oh my gosh, 5 years ago I didn't say, wouldn't it be great if we bought a peninsula and we created a women's association, we created 150 jobs, and we had a music festival. It exists because a community came together and said, these are things that we would like to do. That this is how we want to think differently, and this is how we like to think big in our own communities. People ask me if I want to scale the GLI or we put Intusi in another place. I don't know how you really do that. It's a conversation with the communities. So can you do it in other places? Absolutely. We should be doing this in communities all around the world. We have to start thinking big and thinking differently about how we approach some of those issues. And so on that note, I'm going to open up to questions for you all, if you have it, and then we'll see where the evening goes. Yeah?
Okay, so this whole thing you've been talking about, all these unconventional methods that make like a much larger difference in the community by paying attention, stuff like that, you know. So I was wondering if you have any suggestions of things that students like us can do to approach it from like a different way, like the way we were talking about it, rather than just like going and volunteering or donating money to an organization.
Right. Yeah, you warned me that you were going to ask me that question, so I should be prepared to answer it. And here's the deal: as you all are having these experiences, I think that donating and I think volunteering and all those things remain really, really important. I think it's the approach that you take to doing it. I get asked a question all the time. People say, "Well, why are you helping poor people in Uganda when there's poor people in your own community?" I think for each of you, it's that piece of wherever you want to go help poor people, however you want to help poor people, do that. However you want to engage in your human rights advocacy. I talk to students all the time. I think we have in our universities and in our schools sometimes, I think we've in some ways demonized wealth. That the only way to fix something is to put on flip-flops and go build houses in Africa. And there's some people who do that exceptionally well, and you should do that. And there's some people who are exceptionally great corporate lawyers and great construction managers who do a really good job and have figured out a different way to give back. And so my challenge to you is whatever issues or causes that you're looking at, figure out how you can give back. And when I take students on this trip, the whole piece about it is how do you dig into your passions and understand the communities and understand the people you're serving and understand what you're passionate about and then figure out what that looks like for you and how you want to give back. I had a girl come on the trip about 4 years ago. She wrote me the coolest thank you note ever. It was a handwritten thank you note. Always write handwritten thank you notes. She wrote me a handwritten thank you note, and she got it about a year later. She wrote back. She wanted to be an HIV. She wanted to work with HIV people in the medical field. She's going to volunteer. That was her gig. She asked that question, but she kind of knew that's what she wanted to do. She went over there and she listened and she thought. She had a good conversation. About a year later, I got So I went over there and I did all this. I realized what I was really passionate about was my community and about helping families who were poor. And she ended up going back to her own community in western Colorado. It was a very, very poor area of immigrants in western Colorado. And she spent the last 5 years providing physician's assistance to immigrants in Durango, Colorado. When she went on the trip with the GLI, when she started having that conversation, she wasn't saying, oh my gosh, I want to come back and help them. So part of it's a journey, and for you all, it's do something. Go somewhere and engage and have that conversation. Find out if you, I work very, very well with street kids, and the more cocaine addicted kid was, the better I was. If you put me into a senior citizen's home, they'd all have heart attacks because they'd be mortified by me and not good working with them. I found where my passion was. Find out where your passion is, and then dig in a little bit deeper and find out what makes you excited about it. You know, when I was 22, and people said, what's your dream job, what do you want to do? I didn't say, I'd like to be the deputy chief of staff of the governor and run a research institute in East Africa. So let that journey kind of unfold and let go. And so find something you care about, or a community you want to work in, and give it a shot. Go read books, there's some action that's that piece of, we tend to go right into the fix it before we really understand what positions are. You had a question?
Yeah, so what you're talking about right now is exactly what I want to do with your life. So
well, then we're good, I'm done.
So when I was in Tanzania, I kind of studied NGOs and how, how NGOs are supposed to solve issues and not do it in a way that's simple.
Right.
And so I have a question because when I was learning about all this stuff, I found that there wasn't a lot of cultural context talk when it came to poverty solutions and other NGO solutions. So how would they disseminate this information, because I think it's so important to the people?
Right.
You know what I mean?
Well, that's a good question. How do you disseminate? I met a guy the other day. I've actually known him for about 3 years. I went down and visited his shop. There's a guy by the name of Sam Walton. Sam Walton is actually the grandson of Sam Walton. And he's doing something like this in La Paz, Mexico. And he's doing it with fishermen, because they're overfishing the whole place. And so he's figured out a space for them to come together and to listen and think and talk about. And they've actually come up with this unbelievably community-based solution about how not to overfish. And they're actually making more money than they ever did. And so he's institutionalizing Walmart in the fishing community. And he's doing it in a really interesting way. And so I think that the more we can learn from each other, because I went there to find out that maybe I'm not completely crazy about what I'm doing over here, because and as you're having these conversations, thinking about in Tanzania, well, what does that look like in Tanzania? Like, it's not the GLI, it's not in Twissy, but what does this conversation look like in our own communities? We have to start doing that with our human rights issues. We talked tonight about how quickly we go into the fix-it mode, and we want to talk about poverty. One of the roots of poverty, I truly believe, is jobs. And yet, the same things that we expect for our own communities that we want in our own lives, that we all know that in order for us to have a house and to have medical care and to do the things we do, we need a job. And yet, every year we load onto airplanes and go over to Asia and Africa, and we go build things for people. And at the end of the day, what is the role of our communities in creating jobs? What is that role of the private sector working with the NGO community? It's not to say that the work that you're doing with the NGO community is done, but how is that NGO community then partnering with the private sector to create jobs? I truly believe in our communities, here in the United States and overseas, poverty will start to go down when you have more jobs. And so if you look at what's happening, the hottest topic, my governor, we use my governor, he's all of Colorado's governor. Our governor right now just came out of California. The hottest topic that they're talking about at the Milken Institute, all the hot CEOs and people from all over the country going there, the most interesting conversation they're having right now is about what? You're not allowed to answer this interview. What's the most interesting city right now that people are talking about?
Rio.
Guess. Close! They're talking about Detroit! Like, they're talking about how Detroit's starting to create jobs, and they're starting to rebuild their community. That we need to start having those conversations. And what does that look like? What is the role of the private sector? How does it partner with our nonprofits? And what does that look like? So in terms of disseminating it, to wrap up to a very long answer to your question, I think that it's different everywhere. We've got to change the conversation. because the way that we're doing it right now is working. Other questions? Yeah.
Two things that you brought up on fishing.
I don't know that much about fishing, but we can call Sam.
But, so, one, what is the most inspiring story you have from your experiences? And then the other one is overfishing. Is that, like, I did a project on overfishing, and one of the main problems of overfishing is that it takes the fish away from the people who don't have as good as technology as the big barges that go out there. And is that something that you guys can work with?
Well, you know, it's a great, I'm going to talk about the fishing story first because they know the least about it, and so I'm just going to try to sound smart. It's amazing, because Sam went down there, he doesn't know anything about fishing. He's a river rat, he lives in Aspen, he's a really good guy, he's a nice man, and he goes down there, and he starts really, the way that he's learned all about the overfishing is from who? What's the best way to learn about how people are fishing in their community? Who would you talk to? Talk to the fishermen. So he talked to all the fishermen, and they said, here's what's happening, is that those big barges are coming in, they're taking a lot of our fish out of here, and it's not they don't have rights to those fish. And so they decided to create a coalition to say, how do we make sure that we police the area better? So when those big barges come in, and we partner with the police, that those big barges can get in serious trouble if they fish here. And they started creating order, like in a complicated world, they found out where there could be order. Instead of them all just going and fishing and taking whatever they could get, they realized that they all came together as a community. And each of them took a role in terms of helping police and pay attention to the community. That the overfishing would go down, they would still get as much fish as they needed, and they're making their employment opportunities are increased. And so they figured that piece out. So I think it's such an interesting example because it had nothing to do with Sam. It had to do with the fishermen coming and figuring it out themselves. Most inspiring story came about 5-6 years ago. I love telling the story, so thank you for doing this because it will make me look cool. When I tell you, I like telling this woman I met, and it's such a good story about paying attention because we do miss things all the time. And in Colorado, when we started working with the homeless, we started doing this thing called Project Homeless Connect. We invite all of our homeless. Do you guys have one? That Project Homeless Connect was designed to how do you, for one day, connect the business community with the homeless and connect the homeless with services. So you get volunteers, you have about 300-400 volunteers from the business community, kids, teachers, business leaders, all come together and provide services to the homeless. So, and it's not designed to end homelessness that day. It's designed to how you connect and understand who the homeless are, and then give them something that they need that day. So we would do, if they didn't have their ID or their birth certificate, we didn't tell them where they could go, they could get it right here. We bring in the DMV and the folks that do that. If they needed medical care, we didn't tell them which doctor they could go to. We had doctors there to look at their foot. If they needed a job, we didn't tell them all the places that were hiring. We had people there who were actually hiring. So we do really basic stuff. And we always made it really special. We did it at a really cool place. So the year that my inspirational story happened, we were doing it at the United Club level in Vesco Field. We said, let's do it in a really cool place. We serve really nice breakfasts and really nice lunches, and we really make them feel like they're our guests and not a charity case. And so we go and provide them with transportation. So we had buses that would go pick them up wherever they're. So we go pick up this mom, we go up to the Dolores House, which is a women's shelter. We pick up a group of folks, and this mom and this kid gets on the bus. The kid's like 2 years old. And the mom's there, and I've been working with homeless people for 10 years. I know all the things that she needs, but we always say, what are the 3 things you need today? What are the 3 things you're going to get today at Project Homeless Connect? And she said, I knew what they were. She needed a job, and she needed housing, and she needed some medical care and some services for her kid. And she looked at me, and she's like, yeah. She said, I need all those things. But she's like, that's not what keeps me up at night. So what keeps me up at night? She said, I have a 2-year-old. And this 2-year-old and I have been homeless since he was born. We've lived in shelters, we've slept under bridges, we've slept in the back seats of cars, we've slept on friends' couches. We've never stayed anywhere more than 2 weeks. And she said, what keeps me up at night? And she's like, I'm deathly afraid that my kid is going to grow up without actually ever having a friend. She said, when you help us move into that housing that you said you could get me, is there any possible way that we could be within walking distance of a playground? She said, my son's never been within walking distance of a place where I can go and have him play. And I said, well, shit. We have a 10-year plan that's got all these goals and all the housing we need to build and all the services we need to create and all the mental health and all these things. And it was a really smart plan. But nowhere in that plan did we have that part about a playground. And it was so interesting because we have all the right things, but sometimes we forget the most important ones. That mom that day inspired me because she told me that she wanted something that we all would expect for our own families. That my mom, it was very important that we lived in a place where I could play and I could grow up healthy and I could be safe. And so when we come up with our 10-year plans and our goals and our outcomes and all those things that we need to measure and all those things that are the results, not to forget that the truth is in the work. That while we're doing that, let's make sure that we remember that the people that we're serving are worried about making sure that their kids can go to the playground. That the people that we're serving are worried about making sure that their kids get to go and experience a concert. That those are important too. And so that mom inspired me a lot. Other questions? Quiet. Any other questions? Answer all of them. Yeah?
Could you talk a little bit about the work you do with the governor? Maybe related to human rights.
Sure. So I worked with John Hickenlooper. If you didn't hear that question, she asked if I talked a little about my work with the governor. I have worked with a man for the last 10 years that truly believes in creating a good community and creating a safe community. That it also means about creating a community that has human rights and is a great advocate for. And so my role with him, when he was mayor, I was his advisor and managed all of his social initiatives. So I managed his homeless initiatives and I managed his drug policies. And then when he was governor, now that he's governor, I've worked on all of his housing and homeless issues statewide, health and wellness, education initiatives. We learned at the beginning of his administration, we started shifting our attention to education. We really wanted to let Poland really understand what was happening in education. We learned something really interesting. We learned that in Colorado, about 30% of our kids aren't reading in the 3rd grade. And then we went and looked and we saw that about 30% of our kids weren't graduating from high school. And then we went and looked at that correlation. And you realize that there's about an 88% correlation between kids who aren't reading in the 3rd grade and aren't graduating from high school. That if your kid is not reading in the 3rd grade, there's an 88% chance that your child's not graduating from high school. And then we know that the correlation is even better if you want to look at what your chances are of being in food stamps or going to jail or being homeless or having a substance abuse issue. You look at what that looks like. So we became very, very interested in how do you address that human rights issue and what does that look like in terms of education reform and how do we tackle that? It's interesting. Human rights has so many different dimensions when you're working with the governor, especially in the roles that I've had the pleasure of playing. Arizona, for a long time, used that number. That number is so accurate around education that Arizona used it as a measure of how many prison beds they have to build. That 3rd grade reading level is a really great indicator of all the social problems that you have ahead of yourself as a community. And so we've worked on issues around education and healthcare. I had a boss who stood up very early on in the administration and said that we should champion civil rights and civil unions. He's been an unbelievably powerful advocate for immigration reform. He's been a very loud, outspoken advocate for gay rights. He's been a very loud, outspoken advocate for our homeless in our communities. And so I've played a lot of different roles with the governor when he was mayor, more at a policy level, in terms of how do you work with communities. Kind of same, but different than the work that I'm doing over in Uganda. Like I think about the community building that we're doing down in southern Uganda, and it's very different than how you work with the communities in Denver, but in a lot of ways the conversations and the discourses and the needs of those communities aren't a whole lot different. And so a lot of what I think the governor and I, but we are growing old together, but we've also learned a lot together in terms of what it really truly means these stories and come and talk to you all about it. But as you all start doing the work, it's hard work. When you start going and advocating for human rights, if human rights was easy, everybody would have them. And so you have to advocate for them and you have to be a voice for them. And sometimes, even though it seems sensible, it's not. And people don't necessarily always view it that way. And so that's kind of the role that I play. Any other questions? We're about it's 7:45. So yeah, I'll do a question here and then a question there.
Sorry.
That's all right. I'm in Toledo all night, so I don't have any other place to go.
So following up on your question about like politics and like the governor and all that stuff, how has politics figured into your work in human rights? I was so sure that I didn't want to do anything with politics, and then I learned that it's a huge part of like NGO work. So I was wondering, like, do you get any pushback from local government or like the national government or any officials?
You know, that's a really interesting question. Yes, I think that any of the work you do will involve politics. I think that how you do your work becomes really important for each of you. You all are at a really interesting, this generation is more, has more access and knows more about things than any other generation. The discourse right now sucks. Everybody talks about politics, really interesting. Everybody talks about politics and says, oh my God, politics has gotten so mean. Politics was mean back in the days of Lincoln. If you read Doris Kearns Goodwin, you know that politics, even in the days of Lincoln, people hit people over the head with canes and they had duels and all that stuff. But you know what? At least they were in the same room together when they did it. The discourse has gotten so vitriolic that I can say awful things about you and your family. I can say mean things and do whatever I want. I'm tweeting and Facebooking. You never have to be in the same room with you. And so I think the challenge, as you all are looking at your work, is how do we change that discourse? I look at all the conversations we have about other people without ever sitting in the same room. Things that keep me up at night right now, I think education, if we don't figure out how to deal with education, the inequities in our country around the globe will continue to grow in a really, really disproportionate way. I think that if we don't start paying attention to how we serve our poor, when we talk about Ebola, the reason that Ebola exists is not because of Liberia, it's because people are poor. That if we don't change the discourse, and we don't change the way that we treat each other, we will not solve these problems. I watch how we do it at the national level. I watch how we do it at the Capitol where I work, and it worries me a lot. That we haven't quite figured out how to disagree with each other and to do it in the same room. It's so much easier for me to say what a crazy, crackpot, goofy person you are on a tweet than it is for me to say in front of you, I don't agree with what you're doing. Let's have the conversation. We don't have the conversation. We're having social media clips right now. And it worries me in terms of how the discourse is shifting. And so in NGO work and political work, how do we find a space for us to have those conversations that's different than the way that we're addressing it? I think it's the biggest challenge, not just in the political arena, but in the NGO arena and in our communities. Any questions?
So, yeah, I walked in late, so I apologize. I've already.
I'm usually late for everything, so.
So where did you go to high school?
I went to Weaver High School.
Yeah. And what did you do in high school that set you off in this journey? What do you trace back to your experiences there that were formative?
I told the whole story before you got here, but I just don't want to bore them all because they're like, oh God, please don't answer that question. I had two parents who were teachers. They beat it into me. And so, no, I had two parents that a little bit of a different side of that. My mother worked as a first grade teacher for the poorest communities in Michigan and in Colorado. And it's one of those things where you say you're not going to do what your parents do. And gosh, I really, watching my mom talk about what it was like to watch a kid who didn't have access to very much, what their face looked like. I always asked her, what was your favorite part about your work? She said, the most magical thing about my job, what gave my mom passion, was when she saw the kid's face the first time that they knew how to read. I loved it when she told me that story when I was little. And it's like, and as you all are looking at what you're doing when you're 16, where are you going to find your passion? Like, what is that thing that for my mom that was watching a kid learn how to read, what is it for you? That makes you so happy, you're like, that's where I want to put my energy and my time. And then when you do that, then you'll figure out how to do all the other stuff around human rights and stuff like that. Any other questions?
Do you still sleep only 3 hours?
I try, everybody, that's my work partner. I please sleep a little bit more. I sleep about 3 hours a night. Yeah, I sleep about 3 hours a night.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I do. Yes.
So
Yeah.
we didn't have to take you to a hotel room, really.
No, you can save money. I think that's fair. When I do sleep, I sleep deep. So, well, I know we're having a reception this evening, and so I'm happy to stick around. I'll let you wrap up. But 1,000 thank yous for letting me come here. It's an honor, and I'm so grateful. Maya, thank you for being so passionate, and your family has been so gracious to invite me here. It's an honor to be able to have these conversations. So, thank you.